let's talk about
Cos'è l'empatia? L'empatia è una
empathy.
parola
What
di
is
cui si è
empathy?
parlato
Empathy
tantissimo, che
is
tutti più o
something we
meno hanno
talked
un'idea di
about
che
a
cos'è.
lot. We all
Ha
know what
radice
it
molto
is.
antiche, infatti
It
deriva
is
dal
rooted
greco.
in
Penso che
Greek.
probabilmente anche questo è conosciuto da
You
tutti quanti,
probably
da
already know this
empatheia, che vuol
from
dire composta da
empatheia,
en,
composed
dentro, e
N
pathos,
inside,
sofferenza,
pathos,
sentimento. Ed era
suffering
usata
and
per
feeling,
descrivere
and it
questa
is used to
connessione
describe this
emotiva che si
connection,
creava tra
emotional
l'attore
connection
e il suo
between
pubblico.
the
E nel
actor
corso degli
and the
anni è stata
audience.
è
Over the
stata
years,
introdotta nella
it was
psicologia intorno al
used in
XIX
psychology
secolo,
in the
ma comunque nel
19th
linguaggio
century,
comune
and
tutti
in the
sanno più o meno
common,
cos'è
in our
l'empatia.
everyday life, we know what
L'empatia è
empathy is.
tante cose, forse un po'
Empathy
troppe,
is
nel
a
senso che
lot of things.
l'empatia, come
As you
vedrete
can
qua,
see on the
è
screen,
connessa
it
a un
is
sacco
related to
a tantissimi sinonimi, a
many
tantissimi fenomeni,
synonymous and
che però non
phenomenon
sono esattamente la stessa
which are
cosa.
not
Si parla ad
always the
esempio
same
di
thing. We talk
compassione,
about
di
compassion and
simpatia, di
sympathy,
comprensione, di
understanding,
emozione. Insomma, l'empatia
emotions.
è tutte queste
Empathy
cose.
is all
Però
of
in
these
realtà
things.
parlare di
When we
empatia
talk
come
about
tutte queste
empathy
cose,
and
alla
when we
fine
talk
si
about all of
crea,
the other
almeno per le
aspects, we
neuroscienze,
create in
una
neuroscience a
confusione,
lot
perché
of
non si sa bene
confusion
cosa si deve
because we
andare a
don't know
indagare.
what we should
E quello che volevo
investigate.
presentarvi oggi è una
I would like
definizione che è
to give
stata
you a definition
portata
that
nel
was
2004
given
da
in
due grandi
2004
donne
by
che si
two
sono occupate
important
molto della
women
ricerca
who
dell'empatia, che è una
did a lot of
filosofa,
studies
Federica
in
Vignemot, e una
on empathy, a
neuroscienziata, Tania
philosopher,
Singer, che è stata
Miss
la
Vigneron,
pioniera dello
and
studio dell'empatia nelle neuroscienze, e l'hanno
neuroscientist, Miss
definita in
Singer,
modo
they
tale
define
da
it in
caratterizzare
order
non
to
solo quello che è,
characterize
ma
not
quello
only
che
what
non
it
è.
is, but
E io
what it
userò
is
questa nella
not.
mia definizione di
And this is
empatia.
what I
Allora,
will use in my
innanzitutto
definition
siamo
of
in uno
empathy.
stato
We are
affettivo, e questo penso che
in a
sia intuitivo per
status
tutti
of
quanti. Quindi
affection,
non
state of
è
affection.
il prendere la prospettiva dell'altro, non è un
It's
meccanismo puramente cognitivo,
not
c'è
a
una componente
cognitive,
affettiva, non
there
è
is
solo all'esterno.
an affection,
Questo stato è
there's affection
isomorfo
involved.
allo
This
stato
state
affettivo
is
dell'altro. Cosa vuol dire? Vuol dire che è
isomorphous,
esattamente la
meaning
stessa
that it is
emozione,
the
stessa cosa
same
che l'altra
emotion,
persona.
feeling the
E
same
questo la
emotion
rende
that the other
diversa dalla
person is feeling.
compassione,
This is
dalla
different from
simpatia, perché
compassion and
compassione e
sympathy.
simpatia sono
Compassion and
degli
sympathy
elementi, sono delle
are
emozioni che
emotions
insorgono
which
a seguito del
arise
percepire un'altra
following the
emozione, ma sono
perception of
diverse.
another
Ti vedo che sei
feeling. I
soffrendo,
see that
provo
you are
pietà per
suffering,
te.
I
Questa è la
feel
simpatia.
pity for you. This
L'empatia
is
invece
sympathy.
è io
While
provo
empathy
esattamente il tuo
I
dolore, la
feel
tua sofferenza o la tua
your
gioia.
exact
Questo
suffering and your
isomorfismo è
exact
fondamentale.
happiness. This
E
difference
poi
is
un altro
key.
elemento che, come diceva Clara,
Another
è
element that Clara
molto
was
studiato e
mentioning,
forse
which is
anche
not
molto
studied
poco
enough,
considerato
and little
nella nostra
considered
nozione di
in
tutti i
our
giorni, è che noi siamo
everyday notion, is that we
consapevoli
are
che l'altro
aware
la fonte
that
del
it
nostro
is
affetto.
the other
Cioè c'è
person the
una
source of our
distinzione tra
affection.
la nostra
So there is
emozione e
a
l'emozione
distinction between
dell'altro. Cosa vuol
our
dire?
emotion and the other
L'empatia
person's
senza la
emotion. Empathy
consapevolezza che
without the
l'altro è il
awareness
contagio
that it is the
emotivo ed è
other
una cosa
is
molto diversa,
emotional
perché se tu sei
contagion.
contagiato
If
emotivamente
you are
non ti
emotionally
approcci verso l'altro,
contagious,
sei soltanto centrato su te
you
stesso. Tu devi
are
sapere
not
che quello che
connected
stai
with the other.
provando,
You're only
questa
focused on
emozione,
yourself.
è la
So
reazione della
what
persona che
you
sta
are
vicino a
feeling
te.
is the same emotion
Perché è
that the other
importante
person
questa
is feeling at the
distinzione?
right
Perché le
in front of
neuroscienze
you.
hanno cercato di
Neurosciences tried
dividere
to
ovviamente
divide, to
artificiosamente
separate,
questi due
artificially
elementi
separate
e di
these two
studiarli
elements
e
and to
vedere
study
come il
them and
cervello
see how the brain
condivide
shares
l'affetto,
affection,
ma anche come
but
distingue
also
noi
how it
stessi dall'altra
distinguishes
persona. Cioè
ourselves
hanno
from others.
cercato di
So they
creare
try to
degli esperimenti
make
che permettessero di misurare
experiments
queste due
trying
componenti
to
diverse.
assess these two separate
Allora, lo
components.
studio
The
che è stato
study,
il primo a
which
studiare la
was the
componente
first one
affettiva, quindi
studying
la
the
condivisione affettiva,
affection
e di appunto
part
della
of it,
neuroscienziata Tania
is
Singer.
of
E lei
the
ebbe la
neuroscientist
geniale
Tanya
idea
Singer.
al
She had the
tempo
genius
di
idea
mettere
at the
la
time
risonanza
of
magnetica su due
using of
persone e di
putting in an
utilizzare una delle
MRI
emozioni
machine two
più
people.
forti che
One of
possono
the
essere
strongest emotion
ripetute
that
nel
can be
tempo
repeated over
senza che ci
time
sia più
without
il dolore.
getting
Se tu
used to, that is
ricevi
pain.
una stimolazione
If you receive
biologica,
a pain
poi
stimulus,
si può
you
discutere se
may
il dolore è
discuss if the
un'emozione o no,
pain is an emotion
però
or not,
rispondi, il
but
tuo cervello
your
risponde
brain
nello stesso
responds in
modo
the
più o
same
meno.
way,
Quindi
does
quello
not
che ha
get
fatto è
used to
quello
it.
di
So what they did in this study
attaccare
is to
degli elettrodi che
attach
mandavano una
electrodes,
scossa elettrica
sending an
alla mano
electric
della moglie, che era
discharge
dentro
to
la
the hand of
risonanza,
the
e
wife
alla
inside
mano del
the
marito che
MRI
era fuori,
machine
e
and to the
vedere come
hand
il
of the
cervello
husband who was
risponde
outside the
quando la
machine,
persona
and see
prova dolore,
how
e quindi
both brain
la
responded
prospettiva in prima
when one of
persona
the
del
two
dolore,
felt
ma anche
pain.
quando vede semplicemente una
But
freccia
also when
indicare adesso
seeing
tuo
an
marito
arrow
riceve il
showing that
dolore,
it
e
is your husband receiving pain and you are not receiving any pain. This is an example of the paradigm that was used. They see an arrow showing who of the two is receiving the electric shock, and the dot when the electric current is delivered. So they only see that something is about to happen, and they know who is the target of this stimulation. And what she did is to check how the brain responded to my pain, but also to her pain and to the perception of pain of the person standing next to me. So there is a so-called simulation mechanism. These are areas of the brain, like the front part of the brain, girdle, and so the affection part of the pain is represented when I think of you in experiencing that pain. And this has a very strong correlation at empathy level that I feel. If I feel empathy, this simulation of the emotion of the other in my brain is much stronger. This is affection sharing. So we feel the same, I feel the same emotion.
Allora, questo è un po' più complicato da misurare. Quello che si è fatto
What has been done is the distinction between self and other. Two people were trying to create a discrepancy between the emotions and asking one person how the other person is feeling. For example, I'm in front of you giving a speech. My conference is a disgrace, but the person before me was brilliant. And so how do you think the person who presented before you feels? In order to respond correctly to this question, I have to separate myself from what I'm feeling now and try and feel how the other person is feeling. We did this experiment. We induced emotions through touch. People doing the same task together. We see two images. One was referred to the object they were touched with, and the other to the object that the other person was touching, in order to induce a feeling of pleasure and discomfort. These two could be both positive or negative or different. What we've seen is that our brain and our behavior makes mistakes when we are feeling a different emotions. We try and attribute to the other person how we feel, and that there is an area in the brain, and this one in the association cortex, supramarginal cortex, helping us going beyond our own emotions. If we didn't have this area, we would be even more focused only on ourselves.
Però adesso dobbiamo parlare di genere, perché
so we have to talk about gender now.
Che cosa sappiamo di genere?
What do we know about these two affection and gender components? We know very little. I think Pamela made a very nice presentation on what we know about the function of the brain. We know very little because, unfortunately, very few studies were made trying to compare the two. Or either if you look at the differences and the sample is too small, or they said, let's only look at women because they are more empathic, or maybe we should all look at men who are much less empathic. And so no major study was conducted on this. What was done instead is that there are differences, there are similarities and differences. For example, in this study, the same described earlier,
insieme al soggetto nello scanner.
One person was in the MRI machine, the other was outside, and other two people were given this electric discharge, and they were described as pleasant or uncomfortable feelings. So there were people associated to their feelings. And what they've shown that people, you have similarities. The brain of men and women respond in the same way. If you see the person you like receiving electric discharge, you feel the same emotion and you represent it in your brain. But if the person, you don't like the person in front of you, men don't respond at all, while women do respond, even if they, to the pain of the other person, if they don't like that person.
Mentre la donna comunque, anche se è una risposta inferiore, ha una risposta. Poi dopo discuteremo.
Then we will discuss what all this means. What happens in the difference between self and other? Well, it depends on the situation. There are differences. In some specific cases, what we've seen is that under stress, the stress situation, which in this case is created by the social stress or having to give a speech before an audience where you don't have smiling faces like you, but there are some angry or serious people in front of you creating this stress, men and women respond differently. If you remember this bias, which is the difficulty in differentiating between self and other. Not under stress, women cannot differentiate self from other. They have more problems, while in men the bias is lower. Under stress, the opposite is true. Men become more self-centered, while women don't. This may have several interpretations. This data was interpreted by the fact that under stress, the body try to tackle the problem, while women have in a condition of danger tend to look for help outside themselves. Well, for the opposite is true for men. Is this something biological? Maybe not. Maybe it's only social. Men are raised with the idea that if they have problems, they have to deal with them, while women are brought up with the idea that if they have problems, they can look for help. So all of these differences that we see in the brain from a behavioral point of view we should still understand how much biology has to do with it, or culture rather has to do with it. We should maybe have a society without a gender stereotype. I think it could be possible. And to conclude, 2 last slides. We are working in Vienna on this, that is asking something different, not only if there is a difference from an empathy standpoint between men and women, but there is a different empathy towards men and towards women. There could be differences, and we studied this in the context of the sexual objectivation. We are studying this right now, which means being a person treated and perceived just like for the use of others, rather than a person capable of her own will. This is true because we are bombarded by messages from advertisements. Women are represented as a sexual object in commercials to the benefit of men, in video games, in dolls, everywhere. It's everywhere, really. And of course, someone realized that and said, of course, maybe we should look at this phenomenon more in depth. It has been known for years, and it has impacts. It has impacts on empathy. A study was conducted, and we presented sexualized women where their body was more visible, and the breast and the hips and legs were visible, with the women that were more covered. And what we've seen is that the empathic sharing or affection sharing is reduced towards these people. These were excluded from the game. And our ability to simulate the pain of these people was reduced just because they were dressed differently. And this is crazy if you think about it. It is an automatic mechanism. We feel less empathy, and we don't know why. We're trying to understand that. Does this only apply to women? We don't know. We are trying to figure that out. We're studying this for men. Sexualized men are much more prevalent now. If you see the body of a man a few years ago and now, there are more boys with visible muscles. They want to show their muscles and shoulders. These are signs of sexualization, not only for women, but also something else is changing in men. Why is this changing? Because this reduction of empathy, but one of the mechanisms is the fact that we pay attention to different parts of the body. This is a representation of the eye focusing on certain parts of the body. The red parts are the area of men or women not sexualized, and in blue the ones more sexualized. If a woman is not sexualized, you look at the face. The same for a man. When both are sexualized, people look more at the breast and shoulder. And this change of eye focus simply from the face to the rest of the body diminishes the ability to empathize. We are trying to do our best to understand this better. Thank you for your attention.
Are there any questions? Stay here. Thank you very much, Giorgia Silani. Do we have any? I have a question, first of all. Thank you very much, first of all, for this beautiful presentation. Thank you for having given us insight and something new, which is very interesting, by the way. An important message of your presentation is that, well, since empathy is made up of two aspects, cognitive, affection, you can burn empathic, but you can suddenly become empathic, don't you think? Certainly, yes. Can we learn? Yes, as I said. What happens in terms of development of a human person? Affection sharing is inborn. We are biologically prone. You think of babies, newborns, when they feel, and young children, when you feel your baby with problems or screaming, there is an emotional contagion since the very start. What you can develop as well is to understand that what I'm feeling now is your emotion. This is a fundamental aspect of empathy. Without that, there's no empathy whatsoever. The ability of making a difference between a self and the other can be trained. And also distinction between myself, between self and the others. I was trained as a psychotherapist. They do not only teach and feel third parties or everybody else's emotions. What you feel, is this your own emotion or somebody else's emotion? So the answer is yes, indeed. However, it is easier. I mean, you don't need to train the affection. You need to train your brain, the cognitive part. That's an important measure. Thank you. Another question, and maybe if you have questions from the floor, before the pause, there'd be a sort of buffet in order for us to have a break, in order to digest, so to speak, all the things we heard. I have a question, Giorgia. You don't talk about the mirror neurons. It's an Italian discovery. What's the role of such neurons in empathy? Well, it's the same thing. You know, the mirror neurons are the mechanism which is the basis of all the simulation. The mirror neurons are found in the motor area, while this is in the affection area. However, the basic mechanism, the property is the same, simulating in the first person what you perceive. Same thing. Mirror neurons are an exceptional discovery which has a sort of negative fame, because during years they were used to explain everything, perhaps too much. When there's a certain abuse of a terminology, people just say, well, stop it, I don't want to listen about them anymore. It's a pity, because it's at the basis of any simulation, as oxytocin, which was certainly the golden word, and then the word said, no, stop it, because I can buy it through the internet, you know, which is not the case. Now, let's see whether we have other questions from the floor. Someone who would like to put a question. There'll be time, of course, after our break. There's a hand raised there. Thank you for these magnificent presentations, and thank you to all the speakers. My question, do we have any interesting studies on the ethics, on the ethical aspect? And I refer to the previous question put by Clara. To what extent my own disposition to say, yes, it's good to feel empathy, to what extent this may have an actual resonance with my own empathy? Well, this is certainly a fundamental element. We speak about empathic motivation, to what extent you are motivated, and feel other person's emotions. This is a fundamental element, I think. We do not feel empathy of everybody surrounding us. I mean, there's a sort of selection, automatic selection, or a top-down selection, more aware in this sense. Certainly the motivation that is making an effort, to make it is a fundamental to feel empathy. I don't know whether this was your question or whether you'd like to know something else. Yes, certainly. I'm referring to possible tests or experiments. Claudio Stadler has a question? Yes? Question on empathy, the difference in terms of gender. Empathy is seen as positive. There are authors who say empathy not necessarily is a positive feeling. Empathy may play an important role in society. Think about dictatorships. Empathy, say, towards a dictator. This might play an important role from neurobiological point of view. What do you think about this? And do you think that between men and women, or are there any gender differences in this case? Historically, we know that men and women take a different approach vis-à-vis a dictator, dictatorships, totalitarianisms. Well, this is a very timely question, so to speak, to the point, and spot on. Empathy comes from the fact, well, there's been so many uses of this terminology. Empathy as a movement of affection is useless. It can also be negative. You say empathy towards a dictator, meaning, yes, empathy or neurobiological mechanism behind are those which enable you to wear the same shoes. I mean, to identify not necessarily into something positive. We see that a little bit in the no-vax movement. I mean, there's a sort of identification with a certain styles and mannerisms, a sort of empathic identification. I mean, I'm not a specialist, sorry. Could it play a role? Yeah, it could be the, so to speak, in my courtyard effect. You identify in all those who are similar to you. Too much of this attitude that is only in my garden, in my orchard, it's because you then do not feel any empathy at all towards people different from you. Per se, this is not negative. Empathy is not negative, especially if it means ability to represent and to wear other people's shoes. We very often stop at the very first step. We feel emotions and do not share them with the other, which doesn't foster the empathy towards someone who's not part of our group. Are there any differences between men and women? Well, sincerely, I don't know. We only took men into consideration in the first part of our studies. We are not looking for any complications. And there we saw a very strong role of the in-group and out-group, strong reduction of empathy and affection sharing towards the out-group. In my opinion, you can feel empathy towards anybody, but you have to be able and represent, let's say, the other person. If you stop at yourself only, that's no longer empathy. This is where the problem is.